Contrapunctus by Johann Sebastian Bach. The very title of this work deserves some comment because the word contrapunctus looks very much like the English word counterpoint, doesn't it? And in fact, both of those parts of the word contra and punctus refer to the two halves of the English word counterpoint. Contra means counter and punctus means point. It's, as I told you, a very, very old-fashioned word, a medieval word, in fact, for a note. And the word came into existence, as you already know, from the practice of writing newly composed melodies in short, fast notes against an existing cantus firmus during the Middle Ages. Basically, that's how our tradition of composed polyphony came about. And Bach, in writing a composition of this sort here, is following in a long tradition established in the Middle Ages, and in fact, as you already know, well-educated musicians study counterpoint, they learn how to write fugues, and so on. And basically that's what Bach is doing here. He's basically doodling, and he's writing a composition that he is presenting as an exercise for the instruction of someone who wants to learn how to write counterpoint well, or for the delectation or the enjoyment of people who enjoy looking at counterpoint, looking at its complexities, looking at its many possibilities. This, as you're going to see when you actually hear the composition, is not a work that was intended to be presented to a passive audience. This is definitely not music for listening. Although we have heard fugal passages in compositions, those sections of free imitation that we've heard in previous compositions in this course, and although there are works called fugue that are written for actual listening by other people, this definitely is not one of them. Indeed, when Bach presented such works to the world, he always called them exercises, and he was right to do so because he was well aware that his musical style was terribly old-fashioned. It was horribly out of step with the styles of the times. So whenever you think of these compositions by Bach, think of them as exercises for the instruction of others or for the enjoyment of those who enjoy studying such compositions. They definitely are not concert pieces. You have before you a very detailed listening outline, so please refer to that now. Now, when you look at that outline, you will see along the left-hand side of the outline the names of the three types of sections that you would expect to find in a fugue: exposition, episode, and subject entry. Now we're going to study this outline in some detail, and in fact when you do so you will have an opportunity to review all the things that you need to know about the fugue, especially the 5 principal terms in connection with it, the names of the 2 types of musical ideas, and the names of the 3 types of sections in it. So let's start with the exposition. A fugue exposition by definition should occur at least at the very beginning of the fugue. Every fugue should have one at its beginning, and as you can see here, there is an exposition at the beginning. Now, let's see exactly how we define an exposition. An exposition in a fugue presents the subject in all of the voices. If you take a look at your listening outline, you see that the subject first appears in the soprano, then in the alto, then in the tenor, and then in the bass. So in this 4-voice composition, it has appeared in all of the 4 voices, and it has occurred at the beginning of the fugue as well. So this really is an exposition. Before we move on to the next type of section, let me remind you that the subject was presented in all of the voices in this fugue, and there is also a counter subject which was presented against each of these presentations every time they enter. Now let's move on to the next section of the fugue. It is labeled episode. Take a look at the explanatory material to the right of the word episode. There you will not find any reference to a full presentation of the subject. So this section of the fugue has no complete statement of the subject in it, and it is therefore an episode, basically a digression, a section that sort of gets around presenting the subject in it. Now this is not the time to become complacent. These diagrams that you will find and that I present to you throughout the semester are not without flaw, and certainly this is a good example of such a thing. Take a look at the next section. It is called subject entries. Now, by definition, a subject entry section presents the subject in one or more but not in all voices. Let's see if this section has been labeled properly. In this section, the subject is presented in the soprano, then it is presented in the alto, then it is presented in the tenor, and then it is presented in the bass. By my count, that is 4 voices, 4 statements of the subject in a 4-voice fugue. So what we have here is a situation in which the subject has been presented in all of the voices in turn. So therefore, this is not a subject entry, but this is in fact an exposition. In fact, if you compare its content with the exposition at the beginning, you will see the voices are presented, the subject is presented in the very same voices in turn, and that's why I told you earlier that although expositions absolutely have to begin at, there has to be an exposition at the very beginning of a fugue, expositions could occur elsewhere as well, and here is an example of that. Now the next section of the fugue is an episode, and if you take a look at the explanatory material off to the right, you see that there is no mention of a presentation of the subject, so it is in fact an episode. Now let's move to the next section of the listening outline that is called entries. It refers to subject entries, and let's see exactly what we have here. Now, a subject entry section by definition presents the subject in one or more but not in all of the voices. Let's see if that actually is the case. The subject appears first in the bass, then in the tenor, then in the alto, and then in the soprano. Again, we have a presentation of the subject in all 4 of the voices in turn, so this is not a subject entry section, is it? It is in fact an exposition, isn't it? The section that follows is called a long episode. And if you take a look at the explanatory material to the right, you will see no mention of a presentation of the subject in it, so it is in fact an episode, a digression from the subject and the counter subject. The next section is called entries, and it is properly identified because there are only 2 presentations of the subject, one in the tenor, one in the alto, not in all of the voices as in the expositions earlier, but just in 2 of the 4 voices, so this is properly a subject entry section. The next section is called episode, and if you take a look at the explanatory material, you see that there is no mention of the presentation of the subject, so this is properly identified as an episode. Finally, the last section of the subject is called final entries, and this is a subject entry section. There are presentations of the subject in the tenor and the alto, but not in the other 2 voices, so this properly is a subject entry section.